Robert Holding stood at the panoramic window of his 32nd floor office and gazed out over the bustling streets of Chicago. At the age of 53, he had achieved what he had dreamed of: his own transportation company, Express Delivery Solutions, with a fleet of 500 trucks, 3,000 employees, and partnerships with the country's largest companies. But now his face was tense, and his eyes were full of anxiety. "Mr. Holding," came the voice of Margaret, his personal assistant for 15 years. "Richard is waiting for you in the conference room with an update." Robert sighed heavily and headed for the conference room. Richard Weber, the company's CFO, was sitting at a long table covered with papers and graphs. His normally neat hair was disheveled, a clear sign of a sleepless night. "This is the third month in a row, Robert," Richard began without even looking up from his papers. "The goods are disappearing systematically. At first it was small things, a few boxes of electronics, a shipment of designer clothes. But now, last week, a whole batch of medical equipment worth $300,000 went missing." Robert silently took the report and began to flip through the pages. The numbers spoke for themselves. The losses were growing exponentially. "The worst part," Richard continued, nervously tapping his pencil on the table, "is that everything looks perfect on paper. No signs of hacking, all the documents are signed, the seals are in place. If it weren't for regular complaints from customers about shortages—" "Someone is working from the inside," Robert said quietly, closing the folder. "That's right. And it's not an ordinary employee. Someone who organizes this, has access to the security system, knows the delivery schedules, has connections with customers." Robert walked over to the conference room window. Dozens of trucks with the Express Delivery Solutions logo were parked in the company's parking lot below. Each of them could have been part of the scheme. "Police?" he asked without turning around. "I wouldn't advise it," Richard replied. "Without concrete evidence, it will only damage the company's reputation. And if the information leaks to the press—" Robert nodded. He understood that one hint of a security problem and customers would start looking for other carriers. Their business reputation had been built over years, and it could be lost in a day. "I have an idea," he said slowly, "but it may sound crazy." Richard raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Last month we signed a contract with City Cab to service their taxi fleet. I can get a job there as a driver." "What?" Richard almost choked on his coffee. "You're a millionaire, the owner of a company, and you want to work as a taxi driver?" "That's right," Robert returned to the table and sat down across from his CFO. "Think about it. A taxi driver is the perfect position for surveillance. No one pays attention to them, but they're everywhere, near warehouses, offices, in the industrial zone. I can follow our trucks, listen to conversations." "That's not safe," Richard objected. "If you're discovered—" "No one knows me by sight except the upper management," Robert replied. "I'm rarely in the warehouses or lower-level offices. Besides," he allowed himself a slight smile, "I have the advantage of knowing what needs to be transported and when. I can be there when it's needed." Richard was silent for a long time, looking at his boss. For 5 years of work, he had become accustomed to Robert's unconventional solutions, but this was— "Okay," he finally said, "but I don't like it, and you have to be very careful." "Of course," Robert nodded. "Prepare my leave papers for me. The official version is that I'm going to Europe for treatment. Only you and Margaret will know the truth." After Richard left, Robert went back to the window. The sun was already setting, immersing the city in a reddish light. Somewhere out there, in these streets, someone was systematically robbing his company, and he was going to stop it, even if he had to risk everything. The next morning at 6 o'clock, Robert Holding, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, got behind the wheel of a yellow taxi for the first time. The most dangerous adventure of his life was about to begin. Friday was gloomy and rainy. Robert woke up at 4 in the morning in his new apartment, a small one-room dwelling in a residential neighborhood that he had rented specifically for this operation. Instead of the usual smoothies and fresh pastries from his personal chef, he had instant coffee and a sandwich. The immersion must be complete, he reminded himself. The city cab dispatcher, a plump woman in her 40s named Betty, greeted him with a friendly smile. "New here? Don't worry, dear. The first day is always scary, but you'll get through it." She handed him a tablet with routes. "It's raining today, so there will be plenty of work to do." Robert, now Bob Hunter, as his new document said, got into a taxi. The cabin smelled like pine-scented air freshener. On the dashboard, he mounted a small camera disguised as an ordinary air freshener, one of the few technical tricks he had allowed himself to take. The first few hours passed in the usual hustle and bustle of office workers rushing to work and mothers driving their children to school. Robert carefully watched the routes of his trucks, which came across from time to time. Everything looked normal. At about 10 o'clock, he received a call to an industrial area where one of his warehouses was located. The passenger was a middle-aged man wearing an expensive suit but carrying a cheap sports bag, a combination that immediately caught Robert's attention. "To the center," the passenger said briefly, not looking up from his phone. A few minutes later, he started talking, obviously about business. "Yes, the goods are on their way." "No. This time everything is clear. The documents are perfect. The customer is satisfied with the last shipment and wants to increase the volume." The man spoke confidently, lowering his voice from time to time. Robert strained his ears, trying not to show his interest. In the rearview mirror, he saw the passenger take some papers out of his bag, quickly look through them and put them back. "Listen," the man suddenly turned to him. "How long have you been working in this neighborhood?" 3 weeks, Robert lied, remembering the legend he had created for himself. "And how are things? Are there many orders near the warehouses?" "It depends. More in the morning, when the shifts change." The passenger nodded and went back to his phone, but after a few minutes he continued his questioning. "Do you see trucks often? What kind of goods do they carry?" "Sometimes," Robert answered cautiously, "especially near big warehouses. Express delivery solution seems to be the most common." At the mention of his company's name, the passenger tensed slightly. "Oh, yes. It's a good company. Reliable." Robert felt his heart beat faster. He realized that he had accidentally touched on something important. "Yeah, they seem to pay their drivers pretty well," he added as if in passing. The passenger looked at him intently in the mirror. "You seem to be interested in the transportation business?" "Who isn't? Everyone wants to find a better job than they have." "Listen," the passenger began, but suddenly fell silent when he noticed something in the window. "Stop here," he commanded sharply. Robert obediently parked. They were in a business district, but not where the passenger had originally asked to go. The man quickly paid, grabbed his bag, and got out. Before closing the door, he leaned over and looked at Robert intently. "Forget about our conversation, my friend, and I advise you to take less interest in other people's business. It can be dangerous." Robert watched the man quickly disappear into the crowd. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. He pulled out his phone and dialed Richard's number. "Did you find something?" he asked immediately. "Maybe," Robert replied quietly. "I think I ran into one of them by accident. He was talking about some shipments and documents, and he was very wary when I mentioned the name of the company." "Be careful," Richard sounded concerned. "If they get suspicious—" "I know," Robert interrupted, "but now I'm sure we're on the right track. They are using our trucks for their operations. The only question is how." The rest of the day was uneventful. Robert drove regular passengers, listening to them talk about the weather and traffic jams, but his thoughts kept returning to the morning passenger. In the evening, when he returned to his temporary apartment, he took out his laptop and began to watch the camera footage. The scene of the conversation with the suspicious passenger played over and over on the screen. Robert stopped the video at the moment when the man was taking papers out of his bag. The quality was not the best, but he could make out his company's logo on one of the documents. That was already something. But most importantly, he realized that the game he was playing was much more dangerous than he had initially thought. Lying in bed, Robert could not sleep for a long time. Questions were running through his mind. Who is this man? Who does he work for? And most importantly, who in his company is helping these people? He knew that the answers to these questions could cost him not only his business, but his life. However, it was too late to retreat. A week had passed since Robert began his undercover investigation. He was gradually getting used to the new rhythm of life, waking up at 4 in the morning in his temporary apartment, which seemed so alien after his spacious country house. Instead of the usual workout in his personal gym, he went for a quick jog around the block. Instead of a chef's breakfast, he had hastily prepared toast and instant coffee. Betty, the taxi company's dispatcher, already considered him one of the best employees. "Bob, darling," she would say every morning, handing him a tablet with orders. "If only all our drivers were as responsible as you. No complaints, always on time, and you even take extra shifts." The weather was particularly gloomy that Tuesday. Strong winds were blowing fallen leaves and debris through the streets, and heavy clouds were hanging over the city, threatening to rain. Robert was on his way back from the airport where he had dropped off an elderly couple of tourists when he received a call to Industrial Street, the neighborhood where one of his company's largest warehouses was located. "Order from a VIP client," Betty said over the radio. "Be extra careful." A tall man of about 45 was waiting for him at the entrance to the inconspicuous Morning Star coffee shop. His dark gray suit by a famous designer looked a bit wrinkled, as if its owner had spent several days in it. 2 large suitcases on wheels stood next to him, black with a premium matte finish, but with strangely worn handles. "To the River Plaza Hotel," the man said, breathing heavily after he had dragged the suitcases into the cabin. Robert noticed that the passengers' hands were covered with calluses, atypical for a man in such an expensive suit. The first 10 minutes of the trip passed in tense silence. The passenger kept checking his premium phone, nervously tapping his fingers on the screen. From time to time, he would sigh in frustration and throw quick glances out the window, as if to check if they were being followed. Suddenly, the passenger's phone rang loudly. The melody, the classic ringtone of an old Nokia, again seemed inappropriate for such an expensive device. "Yes, I'm on my way." The passenger's voice sounded tense. "No, everything is fine. I have the goods." "What? Damn!" He raised his voice sharply, forgetting about the conspiracy. "What do you mean the warehouse is being checked? Now? Who gave permission? Couldn't they have warned me before?" Robert concentrated on the road, trying not to show his interest. In the rearview mirror, he could see the passenger nervously loosening his tie and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Listen." The man suddenly turned to Robert, trying to speak calmly, but his voice was shaking. "Change of plans. Drop me off on Oak Street." It was a quiet street of warehouses, almost deserted at this time. Most of the buildings looked abandoned, with broken windows and graffiti on the walls, but Robert's trained eye spotted freshly painted doors on some warehouses and new security cameras cleverly disguised as old ones. When they arrived at their destination, the passenger pulled a thick cream-colored envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "Here's your payment." He handed over much more money than the meter showed. Robert noticed that the bills were brand new, with consecutive numbers. "And one more thing." The man put a folded piece of paper on the seat. "If you're interested in extra income, here is the address and time. Come tonight. Believe me, it's worth it." Robert took the paper, trying to control the trembling in his hands. The time was written on the sheet in neat handwriting, 23 o'clock, and the address of a warehouse in an industrial area. At the bottom was a note: "Show this invitation to the guard. Leave phones in the car." As soon as the passenger disappeared around the corner with his suitcases, Robert parked a little further away and took out his phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed Richard's number. "I have the address," he whispered, looking around constantly. "It looks like there's going to be a delivery there tonight. They're not even hiding the fact that it's connected to our company." "No." Richard's voice sounded alarmed. "It's too dangerous. Let's call the police. I know a detective." "And what are we going to tell them?" Robert interrupted. "That a suspicious passenger invited the taxi driver to the warehouse, that he had suitcases with worn handles. We need concrete evidence, Richard. Otherwise, they'll just move their operations elsewhere and we'll lose track of them." Robert spent the rest of the day carefully preparing for the evening's operation. He went to his apartment, took a small night vision camera out of his safe, one of the few technical devices he had purchased for this investigation. He put on a warm black jacket with no logos and comfortable running shoes. His intuition told him that he might need them. At 11:30, he was already near the address. The warehouse looked abandoned, but Robert's experienced eye spotted signs of activity: fresh tire tracks on the wet asphalt, dim light from the second-floor windows, two men in black at the service entrance peering too closely into the darkness. He parked the taxi a block away, near an old supermarket, and approached the building on foot. His heart was pounding so hard that he thought its thumping could give away the presence of an observer. Hiding behind some rusty containers, Robert began to watch. Around 11 o'clock, a truck pulled up, one of the ones belonging to his company. Robert's heart skipped a beat when he saw the license plate. It was a truck from his central warehouse, which was supposed to be in a completely different location according to the official schedule. Two men in company uniforms got out of the truck and began unloading boxes. Robert recognized his morning passenger as he stood off to the side, directing the process and constantly checking some papers. The suitcases he had ridden in the taxi with were now standing open at the entrance, empty. With trembling hands, Robert took out his camera and started filming. Through the lens, he saw boxes with his company's logo being carefully loaded into another vehicle, a black van with no identification marks. Some of the boxes bore the markings of medical equipment, the exact same kind of equipment that had gone missing last month. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. Robert froze, clutching the cold metal of the container. A security guard with a powerful flashlight walked slowly past him, methodically inspecting the area. When the beam of light slid very close to him, Robert felt a drop of cold sweat run down his back. Waiting until the guard was far enough away, he began to slowly retreat to his car. The camera had recorded enough evidence. Now the main thing was to get out without being seen. But when he was almost to his taxi, he heard a sharp shout from behind him. "Hey, stop! Who's there?" Without looking back, Robert started running. He could hear someone behind him chasing him, shouting orders into his radio, but years of regular exercise had not gone to waste. In a few minutes, he broke away from his pursuer and jumped into a taxi. His heart was pounding as he started the engine and drove out onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, he saw people running through the warehouse with flashlights, but it was too late. He had disappeared into the night traffic. Back at his apartment, Robert sat in front of his laptop for a long time, reviewing the footage over and over again. Now he had proof. He could clearly see the truck numbers, the faces of the participants, and the process of reloading the stolen goods. But the main question still remained unanswered. Who in his company was helping the criminals? Who has the authority to organize such deliveries, change routes, and forge documents? He could not sleep that night. Every sound from the street made him tense. Every shadow outside the window seemed like a potential threat. He realized that, now that he was so close to the solution, the game had become deadly. And the worst part was that he didn't know who he could trust, even among his closest coworkers. The next morning, Robert woke up with a heavy head. The clock read 6 o'clock. He had slept only 3 hours after the night's events. After making a strong cup of coffee, he turned on his laptop and watched the footage again. The screen clearly showed the faces of the workers, the truck numbers, and the process of reloading the goods. But something was bothering him. "It's too easy," he muttered under his breath as he took a sip of his cold coffee. "They're acting too openly, as if they're confident in their safety." He dialed Richard's number, but he didn't answer. That was strange. Usually the CFO always answered the phone, especially when Robert called. After the 5th attempt, he gave up and decided to go to work. Today was his shift at the taxi company. Betty met him with an unusually serious look. "Bob, darling," she said, quieter than usual, "they were looking for you last night. Some people came by asking about a driver who works in our neighborhood. I told them I didn't know anything, but be careful." Robert felt a cold sweat break out on his back. They are already looking for him. But how? He had been careful. "Thank you, Betty," he managed to get out. "I'll be careful." The first half of the day went on as usual. Robert drove passengers, trying not to show his anxiety. Around noon, he received a call to the office center where his company's headquarters were located. A young man in a suit, one of the new managers, Michael Thornton, was waiting for him at the entrance. Robert remembered his personal file well. He had been hired 6 months ago, quickly climbed the career ladder, and had access to the logistics system. And the most interesting thing is that it was after he arrived that the cargo started to disappear. "To the airport," Michael said as he got into a taxi. He looked tired. His tie was carelessly loose, and he was holding an expensive leather briefcase. Robert watched the passenger carefully through the rearview mirror. Michael kept checking his phone, smiling nervously from time to time. Suddenly, he received a message that made him change his face dramatically. "Sorry," he said. "Change of plans. Can you take me to the industrial zone? I need to pick up some documents." "Of course," Robert replied, feeling his pulse quicken. "Which warehouse?" "Oh, you know the warehouses in that area?" Michael suddenly became interested, leaning forward. "How could I not?" Robert replied casually. "I have to drive people there a lot. Express Delivery Solutions seems to be the biggest one there." "Oh, yeah." Michael leaned back in his seat, but his eyes remained attentive. "And how long have you been working in the area?" "Oh, about 2 months now," Robert lied, keeping his tone calm. "You know, after I lost my last job, I had to make some money." "Interesting," Michael said. "What was your last job, if you don't mind me asking?" "What kind of job?" Robert waved his hand. "I worked in a warehouse, but they closed the branch, so I had to look for something new." "In a warehouse, you say?" Michael took some papers out of his briefcase. "And how did you like that job? You probably saw a lot of interesting things." "What's so interesting?" Robert shrugged. "Boxes here, boxes there. Although," he paused, "sometimes strange things have happened." "Like what?" Michael stepped forward, and Robert noticed his hand involuntarily clenching his briefcase. "Well, last week I saw a strange thing," Robert began, watching the passengers' reaction closely, "and they were loading something strange." "Stop!" Michael interrupted him sharply. "Pull over here." They were halfway to the industrial zone, in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Michael quickly paid the bill, but before getting out, he leaned over to Robert. "Take some good advice. Don't look too closely at what's going on in the warehouses. It can be dangerous for your health." When Michael left, Robert immediately dialed Richard's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Something was definitely wrong. He turned the taxi around and drove to the company's office, deciding to take a chance and check on his CFO. In the office parking lot, he spotted Richard's car, but his office was empty. The secretary said that Mr. Weber had taken a few days off for a family emergency. This was more than a little strange. Richard never took time off without warning. Returning home late in the evening, Robert sat in the dark for a long time, analyzing the events of the day. Michael Thornton was obviously involved in the thefts, but he seemed too small a fish for such a complex operation, and Richard's sudden disappearance was disturbing. Robert took out a folder with the personnel files of key employees from the safe, which he had prudently taken from the office before starting his investigation. Looking through the documents, he tried to find connections he hadn't noticed before. Suddenly, his eyes were drawn to a strange detail. 3 months ago, almost simultaneously with Michael's appearance, the security service had been reorganized. The new head was Peter Black, who had been personally recommended by Richard Weber. "Oh, shit," Robert whispered, leaning back in his chair. "Did Richard—" "No, it's impossible." But the facts spoke for themselves. All the threads led to his CFO, a man he had trusted for years. Now it became clear why the criminals were acting so openly. They had cover at the highest level. Robert pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Morgan, an old friend he could trust. "Hey, it's me," he said quietly. "I need your help. One more thing. Could you please check all of Richard Weber's bank accounts for the last 6 months? Something tells me there might be some interesting surprises in there." Going to bed, Robert realized that tomorrow would be a crucial day. If his suspicions were confirmed, he would have to confront not just criminals but a man he considered a friend, and it would be the most difficult test of his life. Robert was sitting in his taxi outside the Blue Moon nightclub, waiting for a meeting. Detective Morgan had texted him an hour ago. There were indeed suspicious transactions on Richard's accounts. Michael Thornton approached the car. His usually impeccable suit was wrinkled and his eyes were darting nervously. "Let's go," he said briefly, getting into the back seat. "Where are we going?" Robert asked, trying to sound calm. Michael leaned forward. "You wanted to make money, right? Now's your chance. We're going to 17 Industrial Avenue." All the way there, Michael was silent, only checking his phone from time to time. Finally, they arrived at an old factory building. 2 guards stood at the entrance. "Get out," Michael ordered. "And don't forget, everything you see here stays between us." They walked through a dark corridor into a large room. The dim light of a few lamps illuminated a dozen people sitting around a long table. Robert felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized Peter Black, the head of security, among those present. "Here's our new friend," a familiar voice said. Richard Weber got up from the table and walked over to them. "How do you like our little company, Bob? Or should I say Robert?" Robert felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. "I don't know what you mean." Richard laughed. "Come on, man. Do you think I didn't recognize you right away? We've been working together for 15 years. But I have to admit, you surprised me. I didn't think that the owner of a multi-million-dollar company would play taxi driver." "Why, Richard?" Robert asked quietly. "I trusted you." Richard came closer, his eyes shining with a dangerous fire. "Trusted me? What about the fact that you never offered me a partnership? I spent 15 years building this company with you, but I was always an employee. So this is revenge." Robert tried to buy time by discreetly pressing the record button on the phone in his pocket. "Revenge?" Richard laughed again. "No, it's business, just a more profitable business. And you know what? You can be a part of it." "What do you mean?" Robert could feel the situation getting more and more risky. Richard walked around him. "It's simple. You continue to run the company as usual, but some of the cargo goes on other routes. We divide the profits equally. Everyone is happy." "And if I don't want to do it?" Peter Black got up from his desk and slowly walked over to them. "Then I'm afraid you might have an accident. You know, taxiing is a dangerous profession, especially in our neighborhood." "Think carefully," Richard continued. "You're a smart man. Why risk everything when you can just cooperate?" Robert looked around the room. All of them were his employees, people he trusted, people he hired himself. "I need time to think about it," he finally said. "You have 24 hours," Richard replied. "Tomorrow, at the same time, we'll expect an answer, and also—" He made a sign, and one of the guards brought a laptop. "Look what we have." A video appeared on the screen. Robert was near the warehouse, filming the process of reloading the goods. "Nice footage, isn't it?" Richard smiled. It would be a shame if the police found out that the owner of the company was organizing the thefts himself to get insurance. "We have all the evidence we need." Robert felt his mouth go dry. "You've thought of everything." "I learned from the best." Richard patted him on the shoulder. "Now go. And remember, you have 24 hours to think." When Robert left the building, his legs were shaking. Getting into a taxi, he pulled out his phone. The recording had been saved. But would it help if Richard had dirt on him? The thought of calling Detective Morgan flashed through his mind, but he held back. He had to be careful now. One wrong move could cost him his life. When he got home, Robert sat in the dark for a long time, analyzing the situation. For the first time in 15 years, he felt completely helpless. His closest friend and confidant had turned out to be a traitor, and the company he had been building all his life had turned into a cover for a criminal scheme. The clock read 3 in the morning when he finally made a decision. Taking a folder of documents from the safe, he began to draw up a plan. He had less than a day to outwit the man who knew almost everything about his business. And this time, a mistake could cost him not only his company, but his life. After meeting Richard, Robert knew he had to act fast. He called Detective Morgan. "Tom, I need your help. Tonight at warehouse number 3, there will be a transfer of stolen goods. Are you sure?" The detective sounded concerned. "Yes. One of the drivers slacked off. This is our chance to catch them red-handed." "Okay," Morgan agreed after a pause. "I'll set up surveillance, but be careful." Robert spent the day preparing for the operation. He studied all the entrances and exits of the warehouse, the security cameras, and the security guard's work schedule. At 10 in the evening, he parked a taxi a block away from the warehouse and walked to the building. The area seemed deserted. Only the wind blew papers across the asphalt, and the lights of the city flickered in the distance. Robert approached the side door, but it was locked. "Strange," he muttered. "They should have started by now." Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. Before he could turn around, strong hands grabbed him. "Don't move," came a rough voice. "Put your hands on your head." 2 guards wearing his company's uniform twisted his arms. The third shone a powerful flashlight in his face. "We found a spy," one of them said. "This is the 3rd time he's come to the warehouse. I can explain everything," Robert began. "Shut up." The guard cut him off. "The security service will be here soon, and you can talk to them." He was led inside the warehouse. Robert looked around in surprise. No trace of illegal activity. All the boxes were in place. The documentation was in order, and the workers were calmly doing their jobs. 20 minutes later, Peter Black, the head of security, arrived. He came closer and suddenly froze. "Oh my God! Mr. Holding." Robert straightened up. "Yes, that's me. And I'd like to know why my own guards are treating me like a criminal." The room fell silent. The guards looked at each other in confusion. "Mr. Holding," Peter tried to remain calm, "we didn't know. The guards noticed a suspicious person watching the warehouse several times. And you didn't recognize the owner of the company." Robert raised his voice. "You were, in an unusual way," one of the guards mumbled, looking at Robert's worn clothes. Robert looked around the room again. Something was wrong. Everything was too perfect, too clean and tidy. "All right," he said at last. "I've been doing a personal security check. and I am impressed with your vigilance. But in the future, such detentions should be conducted more professionally." Peter nodded. "Of course, Mr. Holding. It won't happen again." "No, thank you. I'll take my own." Leaving the warehouse, Robert walked slowly to his taxi. Something was categorically wrong. He took out his phone and dialed Morgan's number. "Tom, did you manage to organize surveillance?" "Yes, my men are in place. But it's all clear. No movement. Robert has stopped. That's what worries me. It's too clear." Back at home, he sat at his laptop for a long time, reviewing the surveillance footage from the past week. Suddenly, his eyes caught a detail. 5 trucks had driven into the warehouse last night, a few hours before he arrived, and they left only in the morning. "Oh, shit," he whispered. They knew everything. The phone rang. The number was unknown. Robert said, "Yeah, I'm here," he said. "Nice try, boss," Richard's familiar voice said. "But next time, be more careful. Not all the guards are as loyal as the ones here today." The call was disconnected. Robert slowly lowered the phone. Now he realized that someone in his inner circle had warned the criminals. Someone knew about his plans and ruined the operation. He went to the window. The city below was going on with its life, people hurrying about their business, unaware of the drama unfolding in offices and warehouses. Robert pulled out a photo from a drawer, a corporate party from 5 years ago. He, Richard, Peter, and other top managers were all smiling, happy, and full of plans for the future. "Which one of you?" he whispered, looking into his face. "Who did I trust in vain?" A thought flashed through my mind. Perhaps there were several of them. Perhaps this was not just a theft, but a well-organized conspiracy. And now that they knew about his investigation, the game was getting even scarier. Robert took out a notebook and started writing down names. Who had access to information about his plans? Who could have known about his visit to the warehouse? The list was too long. He realized that now he had to be twice as careful with every step, because next time the guards might not be so hospitable. After the incident at the warehouse, Robert became even more cautious. He changed his routes, began to change taxi parking lots more often, and kept a close eye on whether he was being followed. One day he noticed a black sedan driving by his temporary home several times. Betty met him with a worried look. "Bob, darling," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Some people came to see you yesterday. Very peculiar people." "What did they want?" Robert felt his muscles tense. "They asked about you. When you work, what routes you take." Betty nervously adjusted her glasses. "I told them you were taking a few days off." "Thank you." He squeezed her hand. "You are a true friend." At that moment, the phone rang in the control room. Betty picked up the phone. "City cab, good afternoon." "Yes, of course. We'll send a car right away." She turned to Robert. "Urgent order. Industrial zone. Express Delivery Solutions warehouse. Will you go?" Robert froze. This could be a chance, but it could also be a trap. "Yes," he answered after a pause. "I'll take the order." As he drove up to the warehouse, he spotted his company's familiar truck pulling out the side gate. Something about it was wrong. This route was not scheduled for today. "Did you order a taxi?" he asked the security guard at the entrance. "No, I don't know anything about taxis," he replied, raising his eyebrows in surprise. Robert quickly turned the car around and drove in the direction the truck had gone. At the intersection, he spotted it turning onto a bypass road. "Well, let's see where you're going," he muttered, keeping a safe distance. The truck drove out of town and turned onto a secondary road. Robert turned off the headlights, relying on the moonlight. The road wound between fields, then went through the forest. Suddenly, the truck braked sharply and turned around. The headlights blinded Robert. "Shit!" He spun the wheel, swerving off the road. 2 men jumped out of the truck. One of them flashed a gun in his hand. "Get out," a rough voice said. "Hands where we can see them." Robert slowly opened the door. In the headlights, he recognized the driver. It was Alex Cooper, one of the new employees. "Alex," Robert said calmly, "I didn't think you were involved in this." "Mr. Holding?" Alex lowered the gun in surprise. "But how?" "Don't put the gun down, you idiot," the other man shouted. "That doesn't change the plan." At that moment, Robert abruptly darted to the side, rolling behind the taxi. A shot rang out and the bullet hit the metal. "Shoot at the wheels!" the unknown man shouted. "He must not leave!" Robert felt his way to the trunk. There, he had a cache with a small camera. He managed to take a few pictures of the truck and the attackers. Shots rang out again. One of the bullets pierced the rear window of the taxi. "Alex!" Robert shouted. "Think about what you're doing. This is a crime." "I'm sorry, boss." Alex's voice was shaking. "But I have no choice. They're holding my family." This information made Robert freeze, so it was more serious than he had thought. They're not just stealing the goods, they're blackmailing the employees. At that moment, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. An unknown man cursed. "Police! Let's get out of here!" "Alex, stop!" Robert shouted. "I can help you. We'll protect your family." But it was too late. The truck was already moving, kicking up a cloud of dust. Robert managed to take a few more pictures before it disappeared around a bend. A minute later, the police arrived. Detective Morgan jumped out of the car. "Robert, are you okay? We got a call about a shooting." "I'm alive." Robert stood up, shaking the dirt off his clothes. "And I have some news. It looks like they're not just stealing. They're blackmailing our employees." Morgan looked around the shot-up taxi. "Jesus, it was a real war in here. You need to stop this investigation. It's getting too dangerous." Robert pulled out his camera. "On the contrary, now we have evidence and a new lead. We need to check on Alex Cooper's family. If they're really holding them," Morgan interrupted him. "Let's go to the station first. We need to write this down and come up with a plan. No more amateur hour." Driving back to the city in the police car, Robert thought about Alex. How many of his colleagues were in the same situation? How many people are forced to work for criminals out of fear for their loved ones? The phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Next time you'll be less lucky. Stop it." Robert deleted the message. Now he knew it wasn't just theft. This is an organized criminal network that keeps his employees in fear. And he had to stop it, even if it cost him his life. After the incident with Alex, Robert spent a sleepless night at the police station giving his statement. His head was pounding with fatigue, but he couldn't sleep. There were too many thoughts swarming through his mind. Detective Morgan organized round-the-clock surveillance of the Cooper family, but so far nothing suspicious had been found. Alex's wife and children were leading normal lives. "Maybe he lied about the threats," Morgan suggested, pouring another cup of coffee from the vending machine. The drink tasted terrible, but it kept him going. Criminals often make up stories like that to justify themselves. Robert shook his head, kneading his stiff neck. "You should have seen his eyes, Tom. It wasn't the fear of a criminal being caught. It was the fear of a father afraid for his family. Trust me, in my 15 years of running a company, I've learned to distinguish between those things." And yet, Morgan tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "Something doesn't add up. We've checked all the Cooper family's contacts, reviewed the surveillance footage, and there's no sign of surveillance or threats." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young officer, trainee Michelle, peeked into the office. "Mr. Holding, you have a visitor. A woman says it's urgent and concerns your company." Linda Walker, the chief accountant of Express Delivery Solutions, was waiting for him in the hallway. Robert had known her for 10 years. Meticulous, attentive to detail, she was one of his most reliable employees. But now he barely recognized her. Her normally impeccable appearance was disheveled, her makeup smeared, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold her designer handbag. "Robert," she looked around nervously, "I need to talk to you. In private. It's a matter of life and death." They went into the empty interrogation room. Linda slumped down on a chair as if her legs no longer held her up. With trembling hands, she took a handkerchief out of her purse and began to nervously crumple it. "I can't keep quiet any longer. All this nightmare began 6 months ago. At first, there were little things, small discrepancies in documents, strange postings that I couldn't explain. I thought they were just system errors. Why didn't you come to me earlier?" Robert asked gently, handing her a glass of water. "I tried." Tears glistened in her eyes, smearing her mascara even more. "I talked to Richard, hinted that something was wrong with the documentation, but he said that everything was under control, that these were new optimization schemes." And then, her hands trembled even more as she pulled a large brown envelope from her purse. "I found this on my desk a week ago." Robert took the envelope carefully. Inside were high-quality photographs. Linda picking up her son from school, her daughter coming out of the sports club, the whole family having dinner at their favorite restaurant. On the back of each photo was a stamp with the date. All the pictures were taken within the last month. There was a note, her voice broke. "We know where your children study. Keep signing the documents and keep quiet. One call to the police and you'll never see them again." Robert studied the photos carefully, trying to find at least some clue. The photographer's reflection in the window, a shadow, anything. "Why did you decide to speak now? What has changed?" Linda wiped away her tears, leaving black streaks on her cheeks. "Yesterday I stayed in the office late to close the quarterly report. I heard voices coming from Richard's office, and I overheard a conversation. They are preparing a big deal, Robert. They're going to smuggle out $5 million worth of medical equipment and electronics. But that's not the main thing." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I heard them talking about you. Someone said that the owner needs to be removed. They talked about some kind of accident with your taxi." Robert felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. He remembered the black sedan that had been following him lately. "Did you recognize the voices?" "I recognized Richard right away." Linda clutched her handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles turned white. And Peter Black. He talked most of all about how to do it." Robert stood up and walked around the room, trying to comprehend what he had heard. "Peter Black is the head of security, the man he entrusted with protecting not only the company but also himself. And Richard, his closest friend, the man with whom they had started the business." "Were there any other details about the operation?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "Dates? Places?" "Tomorrow," Linda whispered. "They were talking about tomorrow night, Warehouse 5, but I don't know the exact time." Detective Morgan came into the room. "Miss Walker, are you ready to make a formal statement? We'll need every detail." Linda shook her whole body. I can't. They're watching me, my children. We can protect you." Morgan sat down next to her. "There is a witness protection program. We'll send you and your children to a safe place, a new life, new documents." For the next 2 hours, Linda told us in detail about all the suspicious transactions she had to process over the past 6 months. She described a complex scheme: forged invoices, fictitious deliveries, double entry accounting. Everything was organized so professionally that even regular audits did not reveal anything. When she finally left, accompanied by 2 policemen, Robert sank powerlessly into a chair. "How could I have been so blind, Tom? Everything was happening right under my nose. People I trusted." "Don't blame yourself," Morgan put his hand on his shoulder. "They planned this well. They used the most powerful weapon of all, fear for their loved ones. Few people can resist that." Suddenly, Robert's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Nice try with the accountant, but you're too late. Say hi to Linda while you still can." He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "We need to check on Linda and her family right away. They know." Morgan was already screaming into the radio. "All units! Urgent check at—" But it was too late. 15 minutes later, a message came in. Linda Walker's apartment was empty. Neighbors saw her and her children get into a black minivan with tinted windows an hour ago. It looked as if they were going on vacation somewhere, with suitcases, calmly, without signs of coercion. "Oh, shit," Morgan groaned. They'd thought of everything, even the fact that she might go to the police. Robert stared silently out the window. It was starting to rain outside. The drops were running down the glass sadly. Somewhere in this huge city, a woman with 2 children disappeared. Disappeared because she dared to tell the truth. "You know what, Tom?" he finally said, turning to the detective. "I have an idea." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Richard? It's me. We need to talk. Yes, I know all about the scheme. And you know what? I want in." After hanging up, he turned to the stunned Morgan. "There's a meeting at the warehouse tomorrow night at 10 o'clock. They think they've broken me. This is our chance to take them all down." "This is insane," the detective shook his head. "They might suspect a trap." "That's why I have to be as convincing as possible." Robert took a photo of Linda with the children from his pocket. "We have to stop them, Tom, before they destroy more lives." The rain outside the window intensified, turning into a real downpour. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled as if nature itself was warning of the danger of the upcoming operation. There were 2 hours left before the meeting. Robert was sitting in Detective Morgan's office, checking the listening equipment that had been cleverly concealed in his clothes for the last time. "Go over that again," Morgan said, spreading out the warehouse plan on his desk. "If something goes wrong—" "I will cough 3 times into the microphone," Robert repeated patiently. "That's the signal for the capture team." "What if they find a bug?" Robert smiled grimly. "Then you'll hear gunshots, and that will be a signal too." "Don't joke like that." Morgan nervously tapped his fingers on the table. "These people are dangerous. Look what happened to Linda." At that moment, a young officer entered the office. "Detective, we have news about the Walker family. They were seen at a gas station outside of town. It looks like they're headed for the Canadian border." "Send the information to the border guards," Morgan ordered, "and increase surveillance on all possible routes." Robert looked at his watch. It was 9 in the evening. It was time to leave. He got up and checked his phone. 2 missed calls from Richard. "I don't like this," Morgan muttered. "They agreed to the meeting too easily. Something doesn't feel right." "That's why we have to be prepared for anything," Robert replied as he put on his coat. "Do your men know what to do?" "Yes. 2 assault teams will be in position. Snipers will control the perimeter. As soon as we have proof of the crime, we'll start the operation." The warehouse was dark and quiet when Robert arrived in his taxi. The security guard at the entrance, not from his company, he noticed, nodded silently and let him in. Only a few lamps were on in the large warehouse. Several men were sitting around a long table. Robert recognized Richard, Peter Black, and several other company managers. "Here comes our main guest." Richard stood up, spreading his arms in a mock greeting. "I'm glad you finally realized where the real money is, my friend." "I'm just tired of fighting," Robert replied, sitting down at the table. "If you can't stop the crime, then lead it, right?" Peter Black nodded. "But there is one problem. We don't believe you." Robert felt the room suddenly get colder. "What do you mean?" "Oh, let's not play games." Richard took a tablet out of his briefcase. "Look at this." The screen showed a surveillance video of Robert talking to Detective Morgan at the police station. The date was this morning. "And that's not all," Richard continued. running his finger across the screen. "Here's you getting your listening equipment. And here's the briefing of the capture team. Nice try, buddy. But the police also have our people." Robert stood up slowly. "So, it was a trap?" "Of course," Peter smiled. "We knew you would try something like that, so we decided to eliminate the problem once and for all." At that moment, the warehouse door slammed open. 4 armed men entered, and Robert was horrified to recognize 2 of the police officers from the raid team. "Communications are down," one of them reported. "Morgan's group has been neutralized." "Great." Richard pulled out his gun. "You know, Robert, I was really hoping you'd join us. But you've always been too... right." Robert quickly assessed the situation. 6 armed men, all exits blocked, no communication. The situation seemed hopeless. "What do we do now?" he asked, trying to buy time. "You're going to shoot me and say it was an accident." "Oh no," Peter shook his head. "It's going to be much more interesting. See those boxes?" He pointed to the stacks of goods. "There's explosives in there. In 10 minutes, everything here will blow up. An accident in the warehouse. The owner of the company, who was conducting a nightly inspection, was killed. And the evidence? The records?" Robert tried to speak calmly, although his heart was ready to jump out of his chest. "Everything will be destroyed," Richard shrugged. "And our little operation will move elsewhere. Business is business, nothing personal." Suddenly, the lights went out. For a moment there was complete darkness, and then... "Police! Everyone on the floor!" came the loudspeaker. Spotlights flashed on, blinding everyone in the room. Tear gas grenades flew through the windows under the ceiling. Robert fell to the floor, covering his head with his hands. "Betrayal!" someone shouted. Shots rang out. Through the smoke and tears, Robert saw the special forces rushing in through all the entrances at once. Richard tried to shoot but was knocked down by an accurate sniper shot. "Are you okay?" was Morgan's voice. The detective helped Robert to stand up. "I'm sorry for making you nervous. We knew there was treachery in our ranks, so we organized a fake operation." "So you—" Robert coughed from the gas. "You planned it all out?" "We suspected they had people in the police, so we put on a show and let them see what they wanted to see. And the real seizure team was waiting on the roof." Half an hour later, the warehouse was filled with police officers. Richard, Peter, and the others were loaded into police vans. Experts found not only stolen goods, but also documents proving the involvement of high-ranking officials in the criminal scheme. "What about Linda?" Robert asked when it was finally over. "She and her children are safe," Morgan smiled. "In fact, they were taken into protective custody right after she testified. Those people at the gas station were a setup. We wanted the criminals to think their plan had worked." Robert watched his former friends and partners disappear into police cars. 15 years of friendship, trust, and working together, it was all a lie. "You know," he told Morgan, "now I understand why they say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer." At dawn, when it was finally over, Robert returned to his taxi. On the passenger seat was a newspaper someone had forgotten with the headline, "The biggest scam of the year is solved." He smiled. Tomorrow there would be a new story, and this time it would be true. A week had passed since the arrests at the warehouse. Robert was sitting in his newly restored office, reviewing the reports on the damage to the company. The numbers were staggering. According to preliminary estimates, the total amount exceeded $20 million. The phone rang. It was Detective Morgan. "Robert, I have news. Richard has agreed to cooperate with the investigation." "And what did he say?" Robert put down the papers, fully concentrating on the conversation. "It turns out that the whole scheme was much more complicated than we thought. Richard claims that he was only the executor. The real organizer is the person you know well." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. "Who?" Robert sat up straight in his chair. William Porter was his longtime business partner, the owner of a chain of logistics companies on the East Coast. They met 20 years ago when they were both just starting out in business. This is impossible, Robert whispered. William, a.k.a.? I know he's your friend, Morgan interrupted. But the evidence is overwhelming. Richard has provided documents, bank statements, phone records. Porter was financing the entire operation, providing cover at the highest level. At that moment, the secretary entered the office. Mr. Holding, Mr. Porter is on the line. He says it's urgent. Robert looked at the intercom, the red light flashing as if mocking him. Tom, he said into his cell phone, give me an hour. I'll try to get a confession out of him. It's dangerous, Morgan warned. He might suspect something. Trust me, I have a plan. Robert took a deep breath and pressed the intercom button. William, good to hear from you. Robert, old friend. Porter's voice sounded worried. I just heard about everything that happened. It's terrible. How are you? I've been better, Robert replied, turning on the hidden camera on his computer. Listen, we need to talk. In person. Sure, I'm in town right now. Can we meet at the Blue Oyster? No. Robert tried to sound calm. Come to my office. There are things that are better discussed, in private. There was a pause on the line. Okay, Porter finally said. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Robert immediately dialed Morgan. He's on his way. Prepare a takedown team, but keep your distance. He must not suspect anything. Robert spent the next half hour preparing for the meeting. He pulled out a folder from his safe with documents he had been secretly collecting for the past week, evidence of how the money from the sale of stolen goods was being funneled through Porter's companies. Exactly 40 minutes later, William Porter entered the office. A tall, fit man in an impeccable suit, he exuded confidence and strength. Robert, he opened his arms. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. Robert shook his outstretched hand. Sit down. We have a lot to discuss. Porter settled into his chair, putting his leg over his shoulder. The horrible story with Richard. Who would have thought he was capable of such a thing? And Peter Black. I personally recommended him for the position. Really? Robert raised an eyebrow. Do you remember when exactly that was? I think it was just before the cargo started disappearing. Porter's smile faltered slightly. I don't know what you're getting at. Robert slowly took out the folder. Then perhaps this will refresh your memory. He spread the documents on the table. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies. It all leads back to you, William. Porter didn't even look at the papers. These are serious charges, my friend, and very dangerous. Are you sure you want to do this? Robert leaned forward. Richard is in prison. He already told me about your role. Richard? Porter laughed. That coward? He has no proof. But I have it. Robert pressed a button on his computer, and a recording of the conversation started in the office, Porter discussing the details of the operation with Richard. Porter's face changed. His good-natured smile disappeared and his eyes became cold. What do you want? The truth, and the return of the stolen money. And if I refuse? Then, in an hour, these documents will be in the prosecutor's office. Porter stood up slowly. You know what your problem is, Robert? You've always been too idealistic. He suddenly pulled out a pistol. Now give me the tapes. All of them. Don't even think about it, Robert replied calmly. The police already have copies. You're lying. Porter licked his lips nervously. Police! Everybody on the floor. The office door flew open and the room was filled with SWAT officers. Game over, William, Robert said as Porter was placed on the floor and handcuffed. Later, when it was all over, Detective Morgan brought Robert a coffee. You know, he was right about one thing. You really are an idealist. Maybe, Robert smiled, but sometimes it's the idealists who win. He went to the window. Below, police cars were taking Porter away. 20 years of friendship, partnership, trust, all of it was a lie. But at least now, the truth is out. "What are you going to do now?" Morgan asked. "To rebuild the company, regain the trust of our clients, and maybe," he smiled, "sometimes work as a taxi driver. You know, it helps you understand people better." The sun was setting over the horizon, turning the sky blood red. Tomorrow would be a new day and new challenges. But Robert knew he was ready for anything now. A year has passed. Express Delivery Solutions not only regained its market position, but also significantly expanded its operations. After the high-profile exposure of the criminal scheme, Robert introduced a new security and control system that became the standard for the entire industry. Linda Walker returned to work. She was now the CFO, replacing Richard. Her children were adjusting well to their new school, and Linda herself seemed to have aged 10 years when the threat finally passed. One spring morning, Robert walked into the city cab. Betty was sitting at her desk as usual. "Boss!" She jumped up happily. "You're here again?" "Just to check in," he smiled, handing her a box of cakes. "And to thank you. I couldn't have done it without you." "You know," Betty squinted slyly, "some of the customers still ask about that nice cab driver Bob, especially Mrs. Thompson on Oak Street." Robert laughed. He remembered this elegant widow who always left a generous tip and tried to invite him for coffee. Speaking of his personal life, it had also changed. At a charity event, Robert met Helen, the owner of a bookstore chain. She turned out to be the woman who could understand and accept all his eccentricities, including his habit of sometimes working incognito as a taxi driver. Detective Morgan became a close friend. They met regularly at the Blue Oyster, recalling that dangerous investigation and discussing new cases. Alex Cooper, the same driver who had been blackmailed by the criminals, was now in charge of the company's transportation department. His experience helped develop a new security system for drivers and their families. As for the criminals, they got what they deserved. Richard, Peter Black, and William Porter were sentenced to long prison terms. Their confessions helped uncover several other similar schemes in other companies. But most importantly, Robert realized that money and success are worthless without honesty and true friends. He started a charitable foundation to help victims of corporate crime and their families. Every Friday, regardless of the workload, he would take his old taxi and go to work. This helped him stay grounded and not lose touch with real life.